The mess tent buzzed with the familiar sounds of another scorching afternoon at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, metal trays clattering, diesel generators humming, and the distant thrum of rotorcraft coming and going like mechanical wasps against the Afghan sky. Major Kestrel Thorne stood behind the serving line, her sleeves rolled up, ladling reconstituted beef stew onto plastic trays with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. To the young Marines filing past, she was just another face in the chow line, a weathered woman in her 30s with calloused hands and dirt under her fingernails, unremarkable except for the way her eyes tracked every helicopter that passed overhead. "Ma'am, could I get extra crackers?" asked Private Morrison, a kid from Kansas who couldn't have been more than 19. Kestrel smiled and tossed him 2 packets. "Fuel up, Marine. Long patrol ahead." What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed as they watched her wipe down stainless steel surfaces and organize inventory sheets, was that the woman serving their lunch had once been the most feared pilot in 3 theaters of operation. Her call sign, Banshee, had been whispered in reverent tones from Kandahar to Mosul, spoken with the kind of awe reserved for legends who danced with death and somehow always came home. Colonel James Hartford discovered this truth entirely by accident while reviewing personnel files for an upcoming mission. He'd been scanning through routine paperwork when a particular service record made him stop cold. Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, Combat Action Ribbon. The decorations read like a greatest hits album of military valor, all belonging to someone currently assigned to food services. He flipped to the photograph and felt his breath catch. The same woman who'd handed him coffee that morning, who'd asked if he wanted cream, who'd smiled politely when he'd barely acknowledged her existence. The same woman whose hands had guided attack helicopters through impossible terrain, who'd pulled Marines from hot landing zones while taking fire from 3 directions, who'd earned a reputation as someone you called when the mission was too dangerous for anyone else. Hartford closed the file and stared out his window toward the mess tent. How long had Major Kestrel Banshee Thorne been hiding in plain sight? And more importantly, why had one of the military's most accomplished pilots been relegated to serving meals instead of flying missions? The answer, he suspected, lay buried somewhere in the classified sections of her record, the parts marked with warning labels and security clearances. But first, he needed to understand how a legend had become invisible. The afternoon heat shimmered off the landing pad as another Chinook touched down, its rotors churning dust into golden clouds. Hartford watched Banshee emerge from the mess tent, her eyes tracking the aircraft with the unconscious precision of someone whose very soul belonged to the sky. She didn't just watch helicopters land. She evaluated their approach angles, noted their mechanical sounds, assessed their pilot's skill with the kind of automatic expertise that never truly fades. A cook who studied aircraft like a predator studies prey. The contradiction was impossible to ignore once you knew what to look for. Hartford grabbed his cover and headed toward the mess tent, determined to solve the mystery of Major Kestrel Thorne. 20 minutes later, Hartford stood in the mess tent's administrative section, facing a woman who'd transformed before his eyes. Gone was the deferential food service worker. In her place stood a decorated combat veteran whose posture radiated controlled lethality. The Silver Star citation lay open between them on the metal desk, its formal language somehow inadequate to capture what he'd just read. "Major Thorne," Hartford began, his voice carrying newfound respect, "I believe we need to talk." Kestrel's weathered hands remained steady as she met his gaze. "Yes, sir, I believe we do." Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced death and decided it could wait. The transformation was complete. Hartford was no longer looking at a cook. He was facing Banshee, and suddenly the air in the tent felt charged with possibilities. Outside, another helicopter approached the landing pad, its rotors singing a song that only true pilots could fully understand. Kestrel's eyes flicked toward the sound, and Hartford caught the briefest glimpse of hunger in her expression, the look of a caged bird hearing the call of open skis. The mission that would change everything was still hours away from being conceived, but in that moment, Hartford knew he'd found exactly what he hadn't realized he'd been looking for. The briefing room filled slowly as word spread through unofficial channels, the kind of communication network that exists in every military installation, where information travels faster than radio waves and rumors become currency. Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos was the first to arrive, his weathered face skeptical as he claimed a seat in the back row. Lieutenant Rebecca Kim followed, her flight suit still bearing fuel stains from the morning's maintenance work. Captain David Okafor entered with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. They'd all heard the rumors. Major Thorne, the cook from the mess tent, was apparently some kind of decorated pilot. The story seemed impossible, like military urban legend mixed with wishful thinking. Santos had been flying combat missions for 12 years and had never heard of anyone called Banshee. Kim had graduated top of her flight school class and considered herself knowledgeable about military aviation history. Okafor had participated in more joint operations than he could count and prided himself on knowing the reputation of every serious pilot in theater. Yet here they sat, waiting to be briefed by someone who'd been serving them lunch for the past 6 months. "This should be interesting," Santos muttered, his tone carrying the particular brand of cynicism that comes from watching too many desk jockeys play pilot for a day. Colonel Hartford entered precisely on time, followed by Major Thorne. The difference in her appearance was subtle but unmistakable, her posture straighter, her movements more purposeful, her eyes scanning the room with tactical assessment rather than cafeteria courtesy. She wore a clean flight suit that looked like it had been waiting in her footlocker for exactly this moment. "Gentlemen, ladies," Hartford began, his voice cutting through the room's skeptical atmosphere. "I want you to meet Major Kestrel Thorne, call sign Banshee. She'll be leading tomorrow's extraction mission." The silence that followed carried weight. Santos shifted uncomfortably. Kim's expression moved from polite attention to barely concealed disbelief. Okafor studied Thorne with the analytical gaze of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Hartford seemed to anticipate their reaction. "I know what you're thinking. 6 months ago, you didn't know Major Thorne existed. Yesterday, she was serving your meals. Today, I'm asking you to follow her into one of the most dangerous airspaces in Afghanistan." He paused, letting the contradiction settle. "Before you make any judgments, I suggest you look at this." He activated the room's display screen. Service records began scrolling past, mission reports, commendation citations, combat footage timestamps. The numbers told a story that seemed too dramatic for reality. 47 combat missions, 32 successful extractions under fire, 0 aircraft lost under her command. The citations read like poetry written in military bureaucracy, each one describing impossible situations resolved through skill that bordered on supernatural. But it was the video footage that changed everything. Grainy helmet camera recordings showed a US-60 Black Hawk threading through mountain valleys while tracers lit the darkness around it. The pilot's voice came through clear and calm over the radio chatter. "Banshee to ground team, I have your position. Coming in hot. Mark your target with IR strobes and get ready to move fast." Santos leaned forward. That voice, controlled, professional, carrying absolute authority, belonged to the woman who'd asked him yesterday if he wanted extra gravy on his potatoes. The footage continued. Impossible landing approaches, emergency medical evacuations, reconnaissance missions flown so close to enemy positions that the helicopter's downwash kicked up dirt from insurgent fighting positions. Through it all, Banshee's voice remained steady, her aircraft movements precise, her tactical decisions flawless. Kim found herself studying Thorne with new eyes. The woman's hands, scarred and capable, told stories that cafeteria service couldn't explain. Her unconscious habit of checking exit routes and assessing threat vectors suddenly made perfect sense. The mission parameters are classified, Hartford continued, but I can tell you this. We need to extract a high-value asset from terrain that conventional wisdom says is unflyable. The target is surrounded by SAM sites, heavy machine gun positions, and approximately 200 hostiles who know we're coming. He looked directly at each pilot in turn. Command believes this is a one-way ticket for whoever attempts it. I believe Banshee can bring everyone home. Okafor spoke first, his Nigerian accent adding gravity to his words. With respect, Colonel, why has Major Thorne been assigned to food services if her record is what you're showing us? The question hung in the air like smoke from a flare. Thorne spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice carrying undertones of old pain. Sometimes the best place to disappear is in plain sight, Captain. Sometimes that's exactly where you need to be. Her answer revealed nothing and everything simultaneously. The room's atmosphere shifted as the pilots began to understand they were dealing with someone whose story contained chapters they might never be allowed to read. Hartford checked his watch. Mission briefing in 6 hours. Flight time at 400. Major Thorne will provide tactical details and crew assignments. I suggest you use the time between now and then to recalibrate your assumptions about who's sitting next to you in this room. As the pilots filed out, Santos approached Thorne. His earlier skepticism had evolved into something more complex, curiosity mixed with professional respect and underlying concern. Ma'am, I've got to ask, if you're Banshee, if those records are real, what the hell are you doing ladling stew in a forward operating base? Kestrel's smile held depths that hadn't been visible when she'd worn an apron instead of flight wings. Sergeant Santos, have you ever noticed that the most dangerous predators are the ones you don't see until it's too late? She gathered her materials with the efficiency of someone preparing for combat. Sometimes disappearing is the most tactical thing you can do. Sometimes it's the only way to stay alive long enough to matter when it counts. She headed toward the door, then paused. By the way, tomorrow's mission. We're going to bring everyone home. That's not confidence talking. That's a promise backed by every hour I've spent watching helicopters land while pretending to care about inventory sheets. The briefing room emptied except for the lingering scent of JP-8 fuel and the weight of unasked questions. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that would soon give way to the darkness where legends flew their most dangerous missions. The equipment cage smelled of lubricating oil and metal, a familiar combination that brought back muscle memories Kestrel hadn't accessed in months. Her hands moved with automatic precision as she checked flight gear that had been waiting in storage like artifacts from another life. Night vision goggles, communication headsets, survival vest loaded with medical supplies and emergency equipment. Each item felt both foreign and familiar, like words in a language she'd once been fluent in but hadn't spoken for too long. Lieutenant Kim appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing curiosity with professional assessment. "Major, mind if I ask you something?" Kestrel looked up from the survival radio she'd been testing. "Shoot." "Your call sign Banshee, how'd you earn it?" The question carried weight beyond casual interest. Call signs weren't chosen lightly. They emerged from moments of truth, usually involving either exceptional skill or memorable failure. Kestrel's hands paused over the radio's frequency selector as memories surfaced unbidden. "Helmand Province, 2019, she said finally. "Medical evacuation in a hot landing zone. Taliban had the area zeroed with mortars, and conventional wisdom said the approach was impossible." Her voice took on the distant quality of someone reliving events through layers of time and trauma. "My co-pilot said I was going to get us killed, that only a Banshee would fly into that kind of fire. The name stuck when we pulled out 4 wounded Marines and somehow didn't take a single hit." Kim nodded slowly. "What happened to your co-pilot?" "He transferred to logistics after that mission. decided he preferred ground duty. Kestrel's smile carried no judgment. Not everyone's built for the kind of flying that gets you labeled as something supernatural. No shame in knowing your limits. And you, what are your limits? The question hung between them like a challenge. Kestrel finished checking her gear and stood, her movements carrying the unconscious grace of someone whose body remembered how to prepare for combat even when her mind had been focused elsewhere. Lieutenant, I've discovered that limits are mostly stories we tell ourselves about what's possible. Tonight, we're going to find out what happens when you stop believing those stories. Across the base, Sergeant Santos sat in the maintenance hangar, running pre-flight checks on the US-60 they'd be flying in 12 hours. The aircraft, tail number 86-4573, had been his responsibility for 8 months, and he knew every rivet, every weld, every potential failure point in its aging frame. But tonight, he was seeing it differently. Instead of a reliable but unremarkable transport helicopter, he was looking at the machine that would carry them into what everyone agreed was a suicide mission. Captain Okafor joined him, carrying coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since the previous century. How's she look? Like a 20-year-old helicopter that's flown too many missions in too many sandstorms, Santos replied, his hands never pausing in their inspection routine. But she's solid. If Banshee can fly her, she'll get us where we need to go. You believe the stories now, about Major Thorne. Santos considered the question while checking hydraulic fluid levels. I believe the video footage. I believe 47 successful combat missions don't happen by accident. What I don't believe is that someone with her record ends up serving lunch unless there's more to the story than we're being told. Okafor sipped his coffee and studied the helicopter's worn exterior. Maybe that's exactly why she's the right person for this mission. Someone who understands how to disappear, how to become invisible until the moment when visibility matters most. Or maybe, Santos said, his voice dropping to match the hangar's conspiratorial atmosphere, she's running from something, and tomorrow we find out what happens when you can't run anymore. The hangar fell quiet except for the distant sounds of base activity, generators humming, vehicles moving, the eternal rhythm of military life continuing regardless of individual dramas. Both men understood they were on the edge of something that would either validate everything they'd heard about Banshee or prove that legends could be just elaborate myths with impressive paperwork. In her quarters, Kestrel sat on her narrow bunk, holding a photograph that had traveled with her through 3 deployments and countless missions. The image showed a younger version of herself standing next to another pilot, Captain Marcus Webb, her co-pilot and closest friend before everything changed. His smile was bright against the desert backdrop, his arm thrown casually around her shoulders in the easy camaraderie of people who trusted each other with their lives on a daily basis. Marcus had been with her on the mission that earned her the Silver Star, the one that had gone wrong in ways that classified reports could never adequately describe. He'd been her voice of reason, her tactical partner, the person who understood her flying instincts well enough to anticipate her moves before she made them. He'd also been the reason she'd requested transfer to food services 6 months ago, when the nightmares became too frequent, and the sound of rotor blades started triggering responses that had nothing to do with tactical awareness. She traced his face with her finger, remembering his voice over the intercom during their final mission together. Banshee, we need to get out of here. This isn't worth it. His words had been prophetic in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Tomorrow's mission would be the first time she'd flown combat operations since Marcus died. The symmetry felt like destiny or punishment. She wasn't sure which. But as she tucked the photograph back into her personal effects, Kestrel knew that hiding in mess tents and pretending to care about inventory schedules had been preparation, not retreat. Every meal served, every helicopter observed, every night spent dreaming of flying had been building toward this moment when disappearing would no longer be an option. The base settled into its nighttime rhythm as midnight approached. In 12 hours, Banshee would return to the sky, carrying with her the weight of legend, the burden of loss, and the promise that some people could disappear completely until the moment when their absence became the most dangerous thing in the world. The mission brief began at 200 hours in a secure room that smelled of burnt coffee and the particular tension that preceded dangerous operations. Colonel Hartford stood before a topographical map that looked like abstract art rendered in elevation lines and hostile territory markings. Red zones indicated known enemy positions. Yellow areas marked probable SAM sites. The entire operational area was colored in various shades of extremely inadvisable. "Gentlemen, ladies," Hartford began, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could orphan children and widow spouses. "Target designation is Kingfisher, a CIA asset compromised during a reconnaissance mission 48 hours ago. Current location is grid reference 41 STE 12340, 5, 67,890, approximately 200 kilometers northeast of our position in terrain that violates several laws of physics and most principles of tactical aviation." He clicked a laser pointer at the map. "The target is being held in this compound, built into the side of a mountain at 8,000 feet elevation. Access routes are limited to a single valley approach that funnels aircraft into a natural kill zone covered by overlapping fields of fire. Intelligence suggests the hostiles know we're coming and have positioned accordingly." Lieutenant Kim studied the topographical data with growing apprehension. The valley approach was barely wide enough for a helicopter, with canyon walls that would eliminate any possibility of evasive maneuvering. Worse, the elevation meant they'd be operating at the edge of the US-60's performance envelope, where margin for error decreased proportionally with available engine power. "Sir," Kim said, raising her hand with the hesitation of someone about to voice what everyone was thinking, "those approach parameters. They're outside normal operational guidelines. One equipment malfunction, one lucky shot from the ground, and there's nowhere to auto-rotate. No emergency landing sites, no alternate routes." Hartford nodded grimly. "Correct, Lieutenant, which is why 3 previous extraction attempts have been scrubbed during the planning phase. Command considers this a no-win scenario." He paused, letting the implications settle. Major Thorne disagrees. All eyes turned to Kestrel, who'd remained silent during the briefing. She stood and approached the map, her finger tracing the valley approach with the precision of someone reading terrain like sheet music. "The previous attempts failed because they were thinking conventionally," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "They were trying to fly through the valley like a highway, maintaining safe airspeed and altitude, following textbook approach procedures." Her finger stopped at the compound location. "But highways get you killed when the enemy controls both sides of the road." She turned to face the room. "We're not going to fly through the valley, we're going to fall through it." Sergeant Santos frowned. "Ma'am, fall through it. Auto-rotation entry at maximum altitude. Power off descent at twice normal rate. Using the canyon walls for concealment until the last possible moment. We'll be invisible on their radar until we're already inside their engagement envelope, moving too fast for manual tracking, presenting a target profile that violates their predictive firing solutions." Captain Okafor studied the map with new understanding. "That's extremely dangerous. Margins for error are essentially zero." "Which is exactly why it will work," Kestrel replied. "The enemy has prepared for conventional tactics. They've positioned their weapons to engage aircraft following standard approach procedures. They haven't prepared for a helicopter that behaves like a controlled crash until it suddenly doesn't." Kim shook her head. "Major, with respect, auto-rotation at that altitude in that terrain with hostile fire. One miscalculation and we're a crater on the mountainside." Kestrel's expression remained calm. "Lieutenant, I've been calculating those variables for 6 months while serving you breakfast. Every helicopter that landed at this base, I've been running approach simulations in my head. Every night when I couldn't sleep, I've been flying that valley in my imagination, working out power curves and descent rates and emergency procedures. She met each pilot's gaze in turn. I know exactly how much altitude we need, exactly when to start the flare, exactly where every boulder and tree and hostile position will be during our approach. The question isn't whether the mission is possible, it's whether you trust me enough to find out. The room fell silent except for the air conditioning's mechanical hum. These were combat pilots who'd flown difficult missions, who understood risk assessment and tactical aviation, but what Banshee was proposing existed in a realm beyond normal operational parameters. Hartford broke the silence. "Major, I need you to understand something. If this goes wrong, there won't be a rescue mission. The terrain doesn't allow for it, and the political situation won't permit it. You'll be on your own in hostile territory with no support and no backup plan." "Colonel," Kestrel replied, her voice carrying echoes of every dangerous mission she'd ever flown, "being on my own is exactly where I do my best work. Besides, the asset we're extracting, Kingfisher, he's been on his own for 48 hours already. Someone needs to remind him that leaving people behind isn't how we operate." She returned to her seat, the map still displaying their impossible mission parameters. Flight time is 90 minutes each direction. We insert at 400, extract the asset and return before sunrise. Weather forecast shows clear skies and minimal wind, perfect conditions for precision flying. Her smile carried the particular confidence of someone who'd made peace with dangerous possibilities. "After 6 months of wondering whether I'd ever fly combat missions again, I'm looking forward to finding out if Banshee still remembers how to dance with death." The briefing concluded with equipment checks and final preparations. As the pilots dispersed to gather their gear, Santos approached Kestrel one final time. "Ma'am, I need to ask. This technique you're describing, auto-rotation into a hostile valley, have you ever actually done it before?" Kestrel paused in packing her flight gear. "Sergeant, I've done things in helicopters that don't appear in any training manual. Tomorrow morning, you'll understand exactly why they call me Banshee." She shouldered her equipment bag with practiced efficiency. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is survive long enough to try something impossible twice. The pre-flight inspection took place under floodlights that turned the flight line into a stage where mechanical precision met mortal stakes. A 60-tail number 862457 sat waiting, its rotors tied down against the desert wind, its hull scarred by sand and time, but maintained to perfection by Santos's obsessive attention to detail. Every system had been checked, rechecked, and verified. Every fluid topped off, every connection inspected with the thoroughness of people who understood that mechanical failure at altitude in hostile territory was just another way of describing death. Kestrel walked her pre-flight inspection with the ritualistic precision of a priestess preparing for ceremony. Her hands traced the aircraft's surfaces, feeling for loose panels, checking antenna connections, examining rotor blade leading edges for damage that could become catastrophic once centrifugal force and combat stress entered the equation. This machine would carry her back into the sky after 6 months of voluntary exile, and she needed to know it was ready for the kind of flying that existed at the intersection of skill and madness. "She's solid," Santos reported, wiping hydraulic fluid from his hands. "All systems green, fuel topped off, survival equipment loaded according to specifications. If this bird can get us there, she can get us back." Kim approached carrying night vision equipment, her expression mixing excitement with well-controlled fear. "Weather update from base operations, clear skies, minimal wind, visibility unlimited. As close to perfect flying conditions as we're likely to get." Captain Akafer finished loading medical supplies and communication equipment, his movements efficient but thoughtful. Emergency frequencies programmed, trauma kit secured, extraction gear ready for deployment. If everything goes according to plan, we'll have Kingfisher out of there before the enemy knows we've arrived." "And if everything doesn't go according to plan?" Kim asked. Kestrel looked up from her inspection of the aircraft's defensive systems. "Then we improvise. Adaptation under pressure is what separates pilots from aviation casualties." She checked her watch, 0330 hours. 30 minutes to wheels up. Final equipment check, then we find out what happens when a Banshee returns from the dead. The crew gathered around the aircraft for final coordination. In the hangar's fluorescent lighting, they looked like actors preparing for a performance where the audience was death, and the reviews were written in casualty reports. Each pilot carried the particular burden of combat aviation, the knowledge that their skill, their judgment, their ability to make split-second decisions under impossible conditions would determine whether everyone went home or whether families received folded flags and carefully worded condolence letters. "Radio procedures," Kestrel began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd briefed countless dangerous missions. "Minimal chatter once we're airborne. Hand signals for routine communication. Voice communication only for tactical updates or emergencies. Call signs remain in effect. I'm Banshee, Santos your wrench, Kim your lightning, Akafor your medic." She pointed to the map mounted on the hangar wall. "Navigation checkpoints every 15 minutes. If we lose communication with base, continue mission according to briefed parameters. If we take fire during extraction, priority goes to getting Kingfisher out alive. Aircraft and crew are secondary to mission completion." Santos nodded grimly. He'd flown enough combat missions to understand the mathematics of military priorities. Sometimes saving one person required risking 4 others, and sometimes those risks were considered acceptable by people who would never have to explain the decision to grieving families. "Rules of engagement," Kestrel continued. "We're authorized to return fire if fired upon, but our primary defensive measure is speed and unpredictability. The enemy can't hit what they can't track, and they can't track what they don't expect." Her smile carried the particular coldness of someone who'd learned to find humor in mortality. They're expecting conventional tactics from conventional pilots. They're about to discover that Banshee doesn't believe in convention. Kim checked her flight suit pockets for the 3rd time, ensuring her survival gear was properly secured. "Major, about this auto-rotation technique, are there any specific cues we should watch for? Any indication that the maneuver isn't working?" "If the auto-rotation isn't working, Lieutenant, you'll know because we'll be having a very brief conversation with the terrain at terminal velocity." Kestrel's tone remained conversational despite the subject matter. "But if you want technical indicators, watch the rotor RPM and descent rate. As long as we maintain rotor energy and controlled descent, we're flying. The moment either parameter goes outside acceptable limits, we transition from tactical aviation to impact physics." The hangar fell quiet except for the distant sounds of base operations, generators humming, vehicles moving, the eternal rhythm of military activity that continued regardless of individual missions or personal dramas. Each pilot understood they were standing at the threshold between routine duty and the kind of operation that created legends or cautionary tales, depending on how the next few hours unfolded. Kestrel performed one final check of her personal equipment: survival radio, medical supplies, sidearm loaded and secured, emergency beacon tested and activated. Everything she'd need if the mission went wrong and she found herself alone in hostile territory, trying to evade capture while waiting for rescue that might never come. "Questions?" she asked, looking at each crew member in turn. "Just one," Akafor said quietly. "When this is over, when we've brought Kingfisher home, what happens then? Do you disappear back into the mess tent, or does Banshee stay in the air where she belongs?" The question carried implications that extended far beyond tactical aviation. Kestrel considered her answer while watching the desert wind move dust across the flight line, creating patterns that appeared random, but followed laws of physics as predictable as the forces that would soon lift their helicopter into the darkness. "Captain," she said finally, "some questions can only be answered at altitude. Let's go flying and see what we discover." The US-60's engine spun to life with mechanical precision that masked the controlled violence of turbine combustion. 24,000 shaft horsepower channeled through transmission systems and rotor assemblies, converting fossil fuel into the kind of energy that could lift 4 tons of metal and humanity into the thin air above Afghanistan's mountains. Kestrel's hands moved across the controls with unconscious expertise, muscle memory overriding 6 months of voluntary exile as switches clicked and systems came online, with the familiar symphony of military aviation preparing for combat. "Engine parameters normal," Santos reported through the intercom, his voice carrying the particular tension of someone who understood that mechanical reliability was the difference between mission success and becoming a smoking crater on foreign soil. "Transmission temperature stable, hydraulics green across the board, fuel flow within normal limits." Kim monitored navigation and communication systems from the co-pilot's seat, her displays showing their current position as a blinking dot on digital maps that reduced complex terrain to colored pixels and elevation numbers. GPS online, communication frequencies loaded, emergency locator beacon armed but not activated. Base operations shows us cleared for departure on Vector 45, climb to flight level 80. "Roger, Lightning." Kestrel's voice carried the calm authority of someone returning to an element she'd never really left. Her right hand gripped the cyclic control with the familiarity of a musician holding a favored instrument, her left hand resting on the collective pitch lever that controlled their vertical destiny. "Wrench, give me rotor RPM at 100%. Medic, confirm all cargo secure for tactical maneuvering." The helicopter lifted off with mechanical grace that belied the violence of rotor blades chopping through air at supersonic tip speeds. 4,000 pounds of lift, generated by aerodynamic principles, that remained sufficiently complex to seem like controlled magic, especially when observed from the ground by people whose relationship with gravity remained purely terrestrial. As they climbed through 500 feet, Kestrel felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever she left the Earth behind. The weight of 6 months spent serving meals and pretending to care about inventory schedules lifted away like shed skin, replaced by the crystalline focus that came from operating machinery at the edge of physics, while navigating hostile airspace in search of someone who'd been abandoned in enemy territory. Base operations, Banshee flight departing for operational area. Estimate time to target 90 minutes, extraction window 30 minutes, return flight 90 minutes. Radio contact will be limited during tactical phases. "Roger, Banshee, weather remains clear, no reported hostile air activity along your route. You're cleared to operate under combat flight rules. Bring everyone home." The radio crackled with static as they moved beyond easy communication range. Below them, forward operating base Sentinel shrank to a collection of lights arranged in patterns that suggested human habitation in a landscape otherwise dominated by geological violence and natural hostility. The desert stretched in all directions, broken by ridgelines and valleys that had been carved by wind and water over geological time scales that made human conflicts seem like brief interruptions in eternal processes. "Navigation checkpoint Alpha in 15 minutes, Kim reported. Course 45, speed 140 knots, altitude 8,000 feet. Fuel consumption normal for current flight parameters." Kestrel adjusted their heading slightly to account for wind drift, her movements precise enough to maintain course within degrees, while avoiding the kind of mechanical precision that would make their flight pattern predictable to observers with hostile intentions. Combat flying required balance between efficiency and unpredictability. Straight lines got you there faster, but random variations kept you alive when people were shooting at your aircraft. "Wrench, how's she handling?" Kestrel asked, noting slight vibrations in the control system that might indicate developing mechanical issues or normal wear patterns that required attention without immediate concern. "Like she knows where we're going," Santos replied. "All systems nominal, no unusual indicators. She's ready for whatever kind of flying you have in mind." The landscape below gradually transformed from desert flatland to foothills, then to the more dramatic terrain that characterized the approach to their operational area. Mountains rose like frozen tsunamis, their peaks catching starlight in ways that made navigation by landmark both possible and treacherous. Valleys carved by ancient rivers created natural corridors that channeled air currents and aircraft alike, but also provided concealment for surface-to-air weapons that could turn routine flights into emergency auto-rotations. "Lightning, start monitoring for electronic emissions," Kestrel ordered as they approached the first navigation checkpoint. "Anything that looks like search radar or target tracking, I want to know immediately. We're entering the zone where they might be looking for us." Kim activated electronic warfare equipment that transformed invisible electromagnetic radiation into visible threats on her display screen. Passive monitoring active. So far, nothing but routine radio traffic and some low-power navigation beacons. No indication of active tracking or weapons guidance systems. The cockpit settled into the focused quiet that characterized tactical flight operations. Each crew member monitored their systems while maintaining awareness of threats that could manifest as mechanical failure, hostile fire, or navigation errors that would strand them in terrain where survival was measured in hours rather than days. The night air outside remained clear and calm, perfect conditions for precision flying that would soon be tested against margins of error measured in feet and seconds. "Checkpoint Alpha," Kim announced. "On course, on time, fuel consumption as predicted." Kestrel acknowledged with a slight nod, her attention focused on terrain that was becoming increasingly hostile with each mile they flew toward their target. Somewhere ahead, in a compound built into the side of a mountain, an intelligence asset waited for rescue that might never arrive. Behind them, a forward operating base full of people who thought she was just a cook continued their routine operations, unaware that Banshee had returned to the sky where legends were born and sometimes died. The mountains rose around them like ancient giants. Their presence felt through air currents that buffeted the helicopter and reminded everyone aboard that they were visitors in an environment that had been killing intruders long before humans learned to fly. The terrain began its transformation from merely hostile to genuinely malevolent as they approached the target area. Canyon walls rose on either side of their flight path, carved by geological processes that had created natural fortifications more effective than anything human engineers could design. The valley floor lay 15